Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as a part of the university's series of celebrations around the life and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today, we bring together two scholars to discuss how Dr. King's vision lives on today and how it will prosper and fare under the incoming Biden administration. This year's theme in honoring Dr. King feels particularly resonant, examining particularly the name of Dr. King's final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? The book was published in June of 1967 at the front end of what would come to be known as the long, hot summer of 1967. For those who don't know or remember, this term refers to the historic 159 race-related riots which erupted across the country, two of which in Newark, New Jersey and Detroit, Michigan, resulted in a combined 69 deaths and injuries totaling over 1,000. Countless other riots rocked the nation. Participating in any one of these riots was effectively putting your life on the line, a risk which countless African Americans took all throughout the summer months and beyond. That was also the time of Loving versus Virginia and the confirmation of Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court, which were seen as victories, perhaps just symbolic for many African Americans. The protesters, however, were not fighting for symbolic wins. There were concrete demands they felt remained unmet, despite prolific death and injury. They wanted access to jobs and housing and to be treated by the police and by the government as all tax-paying citizens. The resonance of that moment is palpable today. We find ourselves in remarkably similar circumstances. The Black Lives Matter protest consumed the summer of 2020 and met with misunderstanding and frustration. The protests in response to George Floyd's murder at the hands of police maintained and grew in intensity as other Black citizens were killed. As in 1967, many lawmakers and fellow Americans found reasons to discount and look down upon the BLM protest. This time it was the violence instead of mere inattention, despite there being fewer than 5% of protests which actually turned violent. The African American community is reeling once again as protesters in the US Capitol this month met a comparatively light police presence. This despite the fact that many who broke into the Capitol were wielding white supremacist and neo-fascist signs and had been active on social media in the days leading up to the protests and the riot. As Dr. King faced an issue of choosing chaos or community in his time, so do we here today at this point in our history. The incoming Biden administration has several pivotal decisions to make as it pertains to the future of race relations and criminal justice in America. For my own part, I reread Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail yesterday, and the themes of peaceful, nonviolent protest, as well as challenging systemic racism and trying to work one's way through extremism and moderation, remain as resonant today as they were now over 50 years ago. So here to help us delve into the real abilities and motivations of the Biden administration are two phenomenal men and scholars who are each scholars on issues of race and will be able to provide us with a fuller and clearer picture of what to expect on the issues as they unfold over the course of the next year and the next 4 years. Paul Butler joins us today from the Georgetown University Law Center, where he serves as the Albert Brick Professor in Law. He's also a legal analyst on MSNBC and was the Bennett Bosky Visiting Professor at Harvard Law School, and is a graduate of Yale with a BA and of Harvard with his JD. Paul is an expert on matters of race and criminal justice, providing content for programs such as 60 Minutes and Nightline, and lecturing frequently for schools and organizations nationwide. Special hat tip thanks to my brother, Carrie Antholis, who has come to know Paul first through Georgetown University Law Center, as well as through Carrie's own blog, Crime Story, where he follows these issues closely. Thanks, Carrie. Hope you're watching. So we're lucky to have you here today, Paul, and are excited to hear from you. We're also joined by the one and only Kevin Gaines, one of the Miller Center's own faculty senior fellows, as well as, perhaps more importantly and more grandly, he is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice here at UVA, where he has appointments both in the history department and at the Carter Woodson Institute, for African American and African Studies. Kevin attended Harvard undergrad and received his PhD from Brown in the Department of American Civilization. He has authored an award-winning book on the intersection of race, politics, and culture, and we are incredibly grateful to have him here at the center guiding today's discussion. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thank you, Kevin and Paul, for teaching us all today. Particular thanks to Alfred Reeves, who works in presidential studies here at the Miller Center and has taken the lead in our annual MLK programming. And thanks to the university's support for these MLK celebrations. So over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Bill. I'd like to welcome everyone to this discussion of race and criminal justice. And it's a new year and a new administration coming in. And so we're thrilled that Paul Butler could join us. And I see this moment that we're in as bookended by two events. And Bill referenced them. The global circulate, well, he didn't, he referenced the most recent event, but the global circulation of the video of George Floyd's strangulation by a Minneapolis police officer at the end of May last year made the reality of police brutality impossible to deny. And George Floyd's shocking execution sparked months of Black Lives Matter protests against police violence across the nation and indeed around the world. And during that time, police were responsible for additional deaths or serious woundings of several more unarmed Black people, including Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, and Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, paralyzed after being shot in the back 7 times by a police officer. During his re-election campaign, President Trump, aided by a barrage of far-right media propaganda, angrily demonized peaceful racial justice protesters. Trump called for so-called looters to be shot and proclaimed his support for police and vigilantes in the name of law and order. Even before the events of January 6th, many observers pointed out the contradiction between the president's law and order rhetoric and his gleeful incitement of the lawless actions of law enforcement and vigilante violence against protesters. Now we know that members of local law enforcement departments were involved in the white supremacist and pro-Trump insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. We know that they were seeking the violent overthrow of a duly elected government. They were animated by the massive lie that Joe Biden's definitive victory by 7 million votes was a fraud. Members of the insurrection built a gallows with a noose outside the Capitol. The Confederate flag of treason and insurrection was paraded through the halls of the Capitol. 5 people died, including a police officer who was beaten to death by the rioters. The involvement of police officers in the white supremacist coup confirmed what Black Lives Matter activists and others have been saying for years, that police departments across the country have long been a haven for lawless individuals who abuse their power and violate with impunity the due process rights of Black, brown, and Native peoples, as well as the rights of those people with disabilities. Many observers also saw a stark racial double standard shown by the lenient, if not outright complicit, response of some Capitol Police to the lawless and violent actions of the mostly white, the mob of white men and women. Now recall last summer, with the Capitol Police's aggressive use of force and mass arrests against peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C. For many in law enforcement, it seems, a violent mob of white men is not nearly as threatening as a gathering of Black people and their allies peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights. So let's kick off our discussion with this question. Paul, how does the insurrection and the role of law enforcement, either as active participants or complicit bystanders, change the conversation on this issue of criminal justice reform?
Everybody knew the insurrection was not a failure of intelligence. The day before, my mom called to warn me not to go downtown on January 6th. My mother is not a law enforcement intelligence officer. She's a retired elementary school teacher who lives in Las Vegas. But she knew that the last time Trump supporters had come to DC to protest the legitimate outcome of the election, they had wilded out, roaming the streets, starting fights, and desecrating Black churches. The local police department knew. Before January 6th, the mayor and the police chief ordered every single Metropolitan Police Department officer on duty. They canceled all vacation days and time off because it was predictable that some bad stuff was going to go down. And now we know that even though federal law enforcement had the intelligence, they didn't act like they knew. They knew, but they didn't act like they knew. Why not? We have to consider two possibilities. One is a shocking negligence by the people who are supposed to protect the Capitol. And this explanation, I think, is Black and white. If protesters from the movement for Black Lives stormed the Capitol to stop Congress from carrying out its constitutional responsibilities, those protesters would be under the jail if they were lucky enough to be alive. Why didn't that happen to the insurrectionists who were mainly white? Here, I'm thinking about implicit bias. So we've all learned that there's something about my beautiful chocolate skin that when a cop sees me holding this, something about my skin makes the cop think that this might be a gun. He's less likely to process this as a phone than if a white man were holding it. But implicit bias isn't just for people of color. Another lesson is that when a cop sees a white man holding an actual gun, the cop is less likely to process that as a gun. It might be a cell phone. Sometimes the seconds it takes the cop to process the gun with the white man can be deadly for the cop. So federal law enforcement officers knew that this very angry group of white supremacists were marching to the Capitol, egged on by a rally where President Trump had said it was going to be wild, and where he told his supporters, "We will never concede, fight like hell, otherwise we'll lose the country." And federal law enforcement knew that just a few days before, these rioters had run roughshod through the city. But they weren't waiting, as you said, Kevin, like they were in Lafayette Square with the tear gas and the rubber bullets and the horses that they used against the legal Black Lives Matter protesters. They gave these white folks extra credit because they were white. And the result is 5 dead people and what is now the nation's capital turned into a military encampment. This is the price of ignoring anti-Black bias. This is the cost of ignoring white supremacy. And then the cost of ignoring history makes us think about complicity, not by entire police departments, but by individual officers. The dozen of cops who've been suspended because they took place in the riots, the Capitol police officers who took the selfies with the invaders, the Congress people who the day before had led the insurrectionists on what now looks like reconnaissance missions. The historical context is an American tradition of white mobs using violence to resist every assertion of constitutional rights by Black people, from abolition of slavery to ending apartheid schools. And the white resistance has almost always been exploited by politicians and facilitated by the police. The last thing I'll say on that question is that the through line between that first explanation, recklessness and negligence, and that second explanation, complicity, the through line is drawn by African-American Capitol police officers. 250 Black officers have an ongoing race discrimination lawsuit against the Capitol Police. They say it's a racist department. That suit's been going on for 20 years. So in that sense, it's not surprising that an anti-Black police department would not be equipped to deal with white supremacist insurrectionists, or that some individual officers provided aid and comfort to domestic terrorists.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I should just note here that for those of you who are tuned in, we look forward to answering some of your questions in the last 20 minutes of our hour together. So please submit them to the chat function, and I will field those, and you have a chance to participate in the discussion. So Paul, you mentioned history and referenced a lot of history in that response. And I think it would be useful if we step back a little bit and talked about the context for where we are now. So let's talk about criminal justice reform policies under the Obama administration. And then just sort of refresh our memories about how we got to this point, we could then talk about criminal justice policies during the Trump administration as well. So let's start with the Obama administration, and I think also importantly the role of Attorneys General Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch and the Justice Department.
Happy Martin Luther King Day. I know that's the occasion for this conversation. Yesterday was actually Martin Luther King Day, but you couldn't go to the King Monument in Washington, D.C. because the National Mall is closed. The Lincoln Memorial, where King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, is shut down for the week. It shut down because of white supremacists who, as you mentioned, Kevin, achieved what their earlier Confederates could not: the planting of the Confederate flag in our nation's capital. So for context, I'm thinking about two parts of King's legacy: the Montgomery bus boycott that made him famous, and that was the beginning of his successful fight against Jim Crow. And now we have only one more day of an overtly racist, white supremacist president who described African nations as shithole countries, who told 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from, who called Mexican immigrants rapists and thugs, and who calls the disease that's killed 400,000 Americans under his watch, he calls that disease the Chinese virus. So unfortunately, raw bigotry and violent anti-Blackness still exist, including in the highest corridors of power. The other part of King's legacy, for context, is from the end of his life, where after he helped to end formal American apartheid in the South, he started to focus on anti-Blackness in the North. And he focused on systems that looked colorblind, but entrenched a racial order with Black people and Native people on the bottom: poverty, segregated housing, disparities in healthcare. This was the fight he didn't win, but he died trying. In fact, he was murdered trying. And so today, Black people are hospitalized for COVID-19 at 4 times the rate of white people. Today, most Black children are raised by an African-American woman who does not live with her partner. Her average net worth is $100. And the context for our conversation about the criminal legal process is today there are more Black people in the criminal legal process than there were slaves in 1850. So I wish King's Poor People's Campaign had come into fruition. His work on what he called the vital reconstruction, what he called the radical reconstruction. That work remains vital and unfinished. For police reform, for the last 30 years, Republicans have mainly not supported it, and Democrats have, in some moderate ways, supported it. So one of the main federal tools is to have the Department of Justice launch pattern or practice investigations of local police departments. The Obama Justice Department, under Attorneys General Holder and Lynch, brought 25 of those investigations. The Trump administration has brought one. But Kevin, this is not Trump exceptionalism. George W. Bush campaigned for president, saying he was going to take the Justice Department out of overseeing local police departments. So President Obama, responding to the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, launched his commission on 21st century policing that made important recommendations for reform that the Trump administration threw in the garbage can.
Yeah, I take your point that the problem of injustice, racial injustice in policing certainly predates the Trump administration. And, I'm glad that you referenced the Dr. King, the legacy of Dr. King that we should all remember, his fight for economic justice, which was front and center in his agenda towards the end of his life. And you mentioned his going to Chicago and other northern cities to tackle systemic forms of racism in housing and in workforce discrimination. But what's fascinating is that Dr. King led a march near Chicago and was hit in the head with a rock. He was greeted by an angry, sort of howling and potentially violent mob that was hurling projectiles at these peaceful, nonviolent protesters. And Dr. King said afterward that he had never, in all of his campaigning, nonviolent direct action campaigns in the South, he hadn't seen, crowds as hateful, hate-filled, and violent. Well, Paul, you started to talk about the Obama administration and Justice Department's more proactive approach in establishing these pattern and practice investigations of police departments. What happened when Donald Trump came in and brought in his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions? If you could refresh our memory on those events, I think that would be really helpful.
In terms of racial justice?
In terms of just the policies, I mean, I think a lot of it would have to be sort of put down to the really sort of the overt and incendiary racist rhetoric of Donald Trump that you referenced. But my sense is that it matters. Elections matter. Attorneys general matter, and Jeff Sessions, brought to coming to the Trump administration as Attorney General, he brought his own history, which I think should have been, quite a warning to advocates for racial justice.
If the question is what happened, you could say that nothing happened, or you could say that we went backwards. Another way of putting both those things is that we had a Republican in charge of the Justice Department. So it's so important, not in this context, to think of Trump as an exception. The policies of the Justice Department on reform of the criminal legal process, on police, on mass incarceration have remained the same under Republican administrations. Indeed, you could say that in some ways, some of the policies advanced by the Trump administration, including the First Step Act, were a baby step, incremental improvement over previous Republican presidents. And so, again, when we think about systemic problems, when we think about structural subordination, we're not only thinking about partisan politics and Donald J. Trump. We're thinking about ways that are built in to the system that President Obama and his attorney generals tried to reform. And it's interesting to wonder what if some of those policies from Obama's task force on 21st century policing had been enacted. His advocacy of what we call procedural justice, his support for reconciliation between communities of color and the police, would that have made a difference? We know that the police kill around 1,000 people every year. We know that from the National Reckoning on Race this summer, it doesn't seem like the police learned a whole lot. It doesn't seem like we did much better, because in 2020, the police killed 996 people. And so unless some people have called President-elect Biden's administration Obama 3, if it's Obama's third term, maybe we'll have the opportunity to see whether reform can make a difference, whether reform is sufficient, or whether we have to think more creatively, more transformatively about issues that have been raised in the movement for Black lives.
You know, Paul, you referenced earlier the uprising this past summer after the killing of George Floyd and other unarmed Black people. And you talked about, you know, the frustration that those protesters encountered. They certainly encountered a really aggressive and inappropriately, disproportionately aggressive response from police. But I think you could also talk about that frustration in terms of a sort of the fleeting nature of support for those protests, and that you know, there was a tremendous backlash, I think, that we could even see within months to those protests. So why do you think that this issue of criminal justice reform, of police reform, is so difficult to achieve?
Because the system is working the way it's supposed to. In my book, Chokehold, I talk about this anxiety that many people have around African-American men. And the response to this nervousness that we cause has been the implementation of a criminal legal process that's all about us. It doesn't mean that we're the only subjects of the state's vast power to punish. But when we ask how things got this bad, why the US locks up more people than any country in the history of the world, when we ask why prison conditions are so wretched. When I was a federal prosecutor and I had to go interview a witness in a prison, the first thing that I would do when I left is to go home and take a shower. Prisons are stinky, noisy, wretched places. Even the best ones are horrible. When we ask, what makes the police so violent and brutal against Black and brown people? African-American men, the anxiety that we create, the legal and social response is what I call the chokehold. And again, Black women, Latinx people, transgender people, immigrants, they all experience the same kind of subordination that African-American men do. It's not a race to the bottom, but when we ask how things got this bad, Black men, again, are the reason why. Now, sometimes people talk about the criminal legal system like it's one. It's a bunch of different systems. Police, prosecutors, judges, lawmakers, prisons, that often don't talk to each other, don't work well together. So just quickly, because I know some of you might think I'm this paranoid Black man, let's look at one part of that system, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has given what I call superpowers to the police with the understanding that those powers will be selectively used against Black men. The power to kill, the power to racially profile, the power to arrest. Think of a case called Atwater, where a soccer mom in Texas got pulled over for not wearing a seatbelt. And she got arrested, booked, taken to prison, jail, mugshot, all of that. She tells the Supreme Court the crazy thing is that in Texas, even if you're guilty of not wearing a seatbelt, you can't go to jail. The maximum punishment is a $50 fine. So how can you get locked up for a crime that if you're guilty of it, you can't go to prison? Supreme Court said, no problem. You can be locked up for anything, even if the maximum punishment isn't prison. Another case, Jones, actually Scott versus Harris. Mr. Harris, very quickly, was a young Black man in Atlanta. Cops tried to pull him over for speeding. Knucklehead 19-year-old kid, he should have stopped, but he didn't. Leads the cops on a high-speed chase throughout the city. Police think that he's causing a life-threatening danger. Never mind, they could have stopped the danger by stopping the chase. They had his license plate number, but they decided to stop the danger that he was presenting. They would kill him. They couldn't shoot him. Professional police departments don't shoot at moving cars. So when he got to the Bluffs, that part of Atlanta with all the hills, they decided they would use their car to ram his car over a cliff. Car burst into flames after it falls several feet. Mr. Harris survives, but he's a quadriplegic. The question he asked the Supreme Court is, can the police do that? Can they really use deadly force to stop somebody from speeding, even if his speeding is causing a life risk to others? Because they could stop that risk again by stopping the chase. The Supreme Court said that what the Atlanta police had done was perfectly constitutional. Kevin, there's a through line between those cases and other cases in which the court extends these powers to police and prosecutors, knowing full well who those powers will be used against. It knows it because every time the Justice Department does one of those investigations, it finds that the police selectively deploy these powers against Black and brown people. I hope everybody reads my book, Chokehold: Policing Black Men. You can get it from your library, from Amazon or independent bookstore. You can read the Justice Department Ferguson report for free online. It's this amazing synthesis of stories and data. The data, every time the Ferguson police used a dog, they used it against a Black person. The story's just one real quick, and then I'll shut up. She called the police because he was beating her up. By the time the Ferguson police got there, he was gone. The cops look around. Does he live here? Yes, she said, he does live here. You're under arrest for violating the occupancy permit. His name's not on the lease. When that happened to another woman in Ferguson, she said she would never call the cops again. She didn't care if she was being killed. Because of these superpowers, it was perfectly legal for the police to stop Mike Brown in Ferguson for walking in the roadway. It was perfectly constitutional for the police to arrest Eric Garner in Staten Island for selling a single tobacco cigarette in a public park. And it was perfectly constitutional for the police to kill him if they believed that he was resisting arrest. And because of these superpowers, what happened in Ferguson and Staten Island, what happened all over the country is what you call police work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been shown time and again that police respond to Black people and people of color with disproportionate force for the most petty offenses or no offenses at all. I think we've seen that quite a bit, and we've seen it actually going back for quite a few years. One of the things that really mystifies me is, why is it that police departments and police unions tolerate this sort of systemic misconduct, and then they pay out hundreds of thousands of dollars for these settlements of civil cases? One would think that police departments and urban regimes would try to put a stop to that, would try to solve the problem so that that wouldn't be the case. What are your thoughts about that?
So there have been some high-profile cases in which people who are victims of police violence or anti-Blackness get legal settlements. And in some instances, we're thinking about millions and millions of dollars, including, deservedly, for the family of Breonna Taylor. But what happens to most Black and brown people who complain about police violence? Well, the number one thing that happens to them is that they get arrested, because that's often the context in which police use violence. So if they survive, the most frequent outcome is, again, that's the beginning of their criminal case. In some instances, if they're brave enough and have the resources, they can complain. And what happens in the vast majority of those complaints is nothing. Or the civilian review board, or whoever the oversight officer for the police is, she finds that the police were not liable. So yeah, in some high profile cases and in some other cases, the police settle. They do pay thousands of dollars a year, but we shouldn't think that the people who receive those payouts are anywhere near the number of people who are subjects and victims and survivors of police violence and police anti-Blackness.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to get to a discussion of what policies the the incoming Biden-Harris administration is likely to do around criminal justice reform. But first, I want to put one of our viewers' questions out there. How long do you think the threat of violence in our capital city will last past the inauguration? And this strikes me as a question about the current crisis that we're living in which really our democracy is hanging by a thread with the rise of domestic terror, white supremacist domestic terror, which just to recall what you said earlier about the Republican Party's indifference to the issue, Republican leaders in Congress denied and tried to silence any kind of discussion or exploration of the issue of domestic white extremist terror. So how long before we can go back to normal, before the monuments that you referenced, the monument for Dr. King and the Lincoln Memorial, will be open to the public?
Kevin, Georgetown Law, where I teach, we like to boast that we're the best located law school in the country. And we say that because our students can literally walk to the Supreme Court. They can walk to the Capitol. Our school today is literally in the green zone in a military encampment called the District of Columbia. So this is now the reaction, the late reaction of our federal law enforcement officers to the insurrection. It's hopefully not sustainable as a long-term solution to have our city occupied in the way that it is. But if the question is, what makes the threat of violence go away? I wish I could say. So I think we can think about layers of vulnerability by Black and brown people. So we can think about our obvious and historic vulnerability to white mobs, to anti-Blackness, and to domestic terrorism. The NAACP was started in the early 1900s, mainly as a response to Black victimization by white mobs, especially lynching. And so this kind of violence is a consistent theme. And again, I hope that it recedes as it does from time to time, but it'll be back unless we engage in the radical reconstruction that Martin Luther King knew would be required to end the Civil War. And until we have that kind of transformation, that redistribution of resources outside of this apartheid that's led to all of this money and power in the hands of a few white elites. And until we transform this radical reconstruction to something that's more consistent with the multicultural, multiracial democracy some of us are trying to get to. And until we get to that transformation, the violence isn't going away. Maybe the police and prosecutors aren't going to beat up people the way they do now, especially Black people. But remember that statistic that I started with. The average African-American child lives with her mom. The mom, in most cases, doesn't live with her partner. The mom's average net worth is $100. I see that as violence. The movement for Black Lives understands that that's violent. And what it teaches us is that we might be able to work on the police. We might be able to work on mass incarceration, but those are just the symptoms. The problem is white supremacy. The problem is patriarchy. And if we fix the police, that's treating the symptom, but the disease will just mutate, like it did from slavery to the old Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow.
You know, Paul, what you just said about poverty, of persistent, systemic poverty being a form of violence, reminded me of what Jesse Jackson used to say during his runs for the presidency in the 1980s. And he was really getting a lot of support from white working class people by highlighting not just a racial justice agenda, but an economic justice agenda, very much in the spirit of Dr. King. And Jesse Jackson used to talk about the economic violence of poverty. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because it brings back, not only the occasion for our discussion today, marking Dr. King's birthday, but really, all of the unfinished business of the civil rights movement and all of those turns in our politics when, as a nation, we left certain roads of progressive politics untaken. And so I just wanted to sort of underline what you just said about that, and to really ask those in attendance to really think about that, to think about violence as not just physical violence, but the psychological violence that comes from being at the bottom of a society that is so wealthy. So,
and frankly, when we think about the bottom, just real quickly, because I know we want to get to hear from the audience. When we think about the bottom, we have to think about the role of the criminal legal process in placing Black people and Native people at the bottom, and the benefits from that attached to white people, all white people, not just elite white people. And that might explain why now so many white folks don't get it, including people who you might expect would. I was, in some sense, amazed, in another sense, not surprised at all, to learn that the districts that supported Donald Trump the most in re-election were some of the same jurisdictions that had the highest rates of COVID-19 fatalities. One scholar has called this dying of whiteness. And what I want folks to understand is how vulnerable African Americans not just feel, but are in this context. What does it mean that 56% of white people supported the re-election of Donald J. Trump? This is a man who, I won't take you through that ugly list of his racist acts again, but we can think about the fact that he presided over a pandemic that at the time of the election had resulted in the deaths of somewhere around 200,000 people. This is a man who was at that point impeached only once, who was clearly corrupt and inept and racist, and 56% of white folks wanted 4 more years.
Well, I mean, I think on that note, we should get into some of these questions. And I do see a question here, and I think this really sort of goes to the question of, or goes to your point that this is not just the problem of African Americans. It's a societal problem. It's a problem for all of us. When you have white supremacist domestic terrorists running amok, it's not just people of color who are victimized. You remember the bombing in Oklahoma City in 1995 by Timothy McVeigh, who was one of the, I guess you could call the precursors or ancestors of this current wave of domestic terrorists. So here's a question. Do you see reasons to hope that the greater diversity of post-George Floyd BLM protesters signals a more enduring, okay, so the questions are coming in so fast that it got knocked out of the queue. The question is basically, did the sort of the multiracial nature, multi-generational nature of the protests in the summer, does that augur well for the future?
It does. So then we don't focus so much on the 56%, but the 44%. The 44% of white folks who rejected Donald Trump, and combined with a majority of African American people, somewhere around 90%, of Latinx people, somewhere around 66%, and Asian American people, upwards of 50%, who all voted against a white supremacist regime for another 4 years. So this coalition of this critical mass, a minority, but critical mass of white people, combined with African Americans, Latinx people, Asian Americans, and Native people, that's where the hope is, that this coalition of conscience can help us become the multiracial democracy that we never have achieved, but a lot of us hope that we might someday get to.
It almost seems like the Obama years, were a moment in which that multiracial democracy was coming into being. And I think there were a lot of assumptions that, the Democrats were going to have a majority due to, the demographic changes and, the eventual shift to a majority minority population in the middle of the 21st century. That hasn't really panned out. Here's a question, and it's a historical question, and it recalls the Rodney King incident and the Rodney King beating, which was in 1991, which gives you an idea of how long this problem has gone on, and of course it goes back even earlier. But what kind of police reform was recommended? And what happened after the Rodney King beating, which of course, African Americans and people everywhere waited for the system to run its course. They waited for justice. Justice didn't come when those 4 policemen who were caught on videotape beating Rodney King were acquitted. And so you had the LA rebellion and massive destruction and loss of life. So what the question is, what didn't get reformed and why after that incident, which seemed to be a turning point in sort of the general public recognition of this problem of police brutality?
The main reform that came out of the Rodney King beating was the establishment of the federal Justice Department and these pattern and practice investigations that I've talked about. And what we know about these investigations is that they're very expensive. If there's progress, it seems to be short term. And as we've already noted, is political. When there's a Democrat in the White House, the department does these investigations. When there's not a Democrat in the White House, the department does not do these investigations. When I say that the reforms are expensive and short term, that doesn't mean that they're not important. In this context, when it works, what it means is that even for a while, the police don't kill and beat up as many Black and brown people as they would if the reform hadn't started. They don't arrest as many Black and brown people in situations in which they would not arrest white folks. So that's positive. That's encouraging. The good news is that the mayor and the police chief have way more power over local policing than the attorney general or the president of the United States. Because of our system of federalism, there are 18,000 different police departments in the United States. And that means that there are 18,000 different ways of policing. And there are federal regulations that pretty much require most jurisdictions to have laws that say you could turn right on a red light. Federal laws that cover like what you do when you're waiting at a red light. There's no federal laws that require any kind of uniform standards for the people who are licensed to kill. No required federal standards on competency, on training. And the good news there is, again, it's the mayor, it's the police chief, it's your local prosecutor who have the most say. And in states, especially after the defund the police movement of this summer, we've seen reform. The most popular reaction that I can see to defund the police has been cities all over the country are defunding the police. If what that means is reallocating some of the money away from the people with guns and to crime prevention, to community services, to healthcare, that we know helps make families and communities safer, then giving all of that to the men and women in blue.
Well, on that note of potential reforms and potential actions that can be taken, I really want to read this question from Tazia. As a first-year Black woman at UVA, I'm considering the ways in which I can affect the most change in the criminal justice system now and in my future professional career. How would you suggest that Black college students join the fight for policing criminal justice reform?
To understand, as the movement does, that it's not only about the police and prosecutors or criminal justice. Some people have said that eviction is to Black women what mass incarceration is to Black men. To be sure, African-American women are also survivors of mass incarceration and police brutality. And in fact, after being beat up by cops, the #1 complaint that officers get is sexual harassment. And most of those complaints come from African-American women. And so for law students, again, even if your thing isn't criminal justice, you can't see yourself being a prosecutor or even a defense attorney. If you use your skills to, and this is a tall order, to crush white supremacy, to defeat the patriarchy, you will be advancing the cause. You will be helping Black lives to matter in the law, the same way that white lives matter right now. And so in my book, Chokehold, I think about some reform ways that make a difference and some transformative ways. I think, Kevin, that we lawyers in the House, we're good at reform. We're not as good at transformation because, and that often is led by our clients, who in this case are people who've been in the system, people on the bottom, people who have family members in the system, people who know that the system does not make us safe, people who understand that police departments evolve from state patrols, which makes us, again, wonder if the project of policing, as many believe, is not a project about public safety. It's a project about racial subordination. It's a project about enforcing a racial law and order. And so people who are radically aligned with the defund the police, they say defund means defund. Well, why would you want to fund a project that doesn't make us safer and that in fact makes African Americans less free? I know we're short on time, so I guess I'll end with just urging that student and everybody else listening, no matter what your race, to do something. I wonder what the conversation was like, Kevin, in the faculty lounge the day after Plessy versus Ferguson or Korematsu was decided. I wonder if that came up in class discussion. I also wonder what I would have done back in the day. If I'd been born an enslaved person, I hope that I would have been a runaway. I hope that I would have been one of those folks who led insurrections. Kevin, you know from your important work on history that most Black people didn't do that. Most slaves didn't do that. Same thing with the civil rights movement. I hope that, like my mom, I would have marched with Martin or taken it to the streets with Malcolm. Most people, including most Black and brown people, didn't. In the movement for Black lives, the expression is, if you want to know what you would have done back in the day, ask yourself, what are you doing right now? Because these are some of the most important social justice movements of our time.
Amen to that. And you know, racially discriminatory policing and law enforcement are the last bastion of violent white supremacy. And I think that threatens all of us. It threatens our society. It threatens our democracy. And there's a divide. We've seen now a divide within law enforcement between those police officers who defended democracy and those who are out to destroy it. And so this makes this cause of criminal justice reform all the more urgent. And I'd like to thank Paul Butler. I highly recommend his book, Chokehold, for spending this time with us. And thanks to all of you who tuned in. Thanks for all your questions. And we hope you'll join us at the Miller Center once again soon. Thank you.